Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Silkenat. I practice law in New York City, and I'm president of the American Bar Association for this year with our 400,000 members. Welcome to today's special Law Day program, The Vote, When Does Suffrage Become Universal? It's truly a pleasure to be here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in the heart of our nation's capital. This is our 13th annual Leon Jaworski Public Program to commemorate Law Day, and our 5th year conducting it here at the Wilson Center. We are very pleased to have the Wilson Center as our host and as our program partner. And I'm delighted to introduce Jane Harman, Director, President, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. Jane.
No, Jane is not here. She had to
Well,
sorry.
okay. Then I am very pleased to introduce Pauline Weaver, who is serving as National Law Day Chair. Pauline.
Thanks very much, Jim. I appreciate the introduction. The Standing Committee on Public Education has had a primary role in planning and organizing this program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. As National Law Day Chair, I'm honored to serve on the Standing Committee. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the distinguished lawyer Leon Jaworski, for whom this program is named. Of course, he's renowned for his role in Watergate. After the Saturday Night Massacre of October the 20th, 1973, he was appointed as the second Watergate Special Prosecutor. 2 years before that, however, he became president of the American Bar Association and set about establishing the special committee that developed into the ABA Division for Public Education. A bequest from his estate in 1983 established an endowment fund which continues to support the annual ABA programs, such as this one, dedicated to advancing public understanding of the law and its role in society. The American Bar Association has been pleased to partner with the Wilson Center in conducting the 2014 Leon Jaworski Public Program. We are also delighted to not only work with the Wilson Center, but with 2 other partner organizations, and I'd like to acknowledge these organizations and their leaders who are with us today. The League of Women Voters, Elizabeth McNamara, President, and Nancy Tate, Executive Director, and the Federation for State Humanities Council, Esther McIntosh, President. We thank them both for their cooperation and their support. The American Bar Association is organizing today's program as a part of this year's observance of Law Day. Since 1958, Law Day has been an annual opportunity for us to reaffirm our commitment to the rule of law. It is celebrated by bar associations, courts, schools, and community groups all over the country. They organize programs for young people and adults to increase their understanding of the principle of the rule of law and law's essential role in American society. The ABA provides leadership and resources to assist these efforts. In keeping with this year's theme for Law Day, we are pleased to present the 2015 Leon Jaworski Public Program on The Vote, When Does Suffrage Become Universal? Thank you, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you, Pauline. I would like to say just a couple of words about this year's Law Day theme, American Democracy and the Rule of Law, Why Every Vote Matters, and its connection to the Jaworski program. The obvious connection is voting is the very foundation of electoral democracy. The Law Day theme this year is a way to remind all of us of the importance of the right to vote and the challenges we still face in ensuring that every vote matters and that everyone has the opportunity to participate in our democracy. To that end, the 2014 Leon Jaworski Public Program will focus on the ideal and practice of universal suffrage, emphasizing and exploring the every in the 2014 Law Day theme. Scholars have traced the history of universal suffrage to the democratic revolutions of the late 18th century and the subsequent development of the norms and institutions of electoral democracy, beginning in the early 19th century. The use of the term universal suffrage also dates to this period. In considering the fundamental concept of universal suffrage, we can illuminate contentious contemporary issues related to citizenship, enfranchisement, and disenfranchisement. I'm pleased that this year's Leon Jaworski Public Program commemorates Law Day 2014 by discussing the idea and reality of universal suffrage and its relationship to democracy in the United States and around the world. So, to begin our program, I'd like to introduce our program moderator, John Milewski. John is a director of digital programming for the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He serves as executive producer, host, and managing editor of Context, Wilson Center Now, and other programs. He's a veteran broadcast journalist and communications professional with extensive experience as a moderator, interviewer, anchor, reporter, and producer. John is a frequent moderator for the Leon Jaworski series and other public programs and panel discussions of the ABA and our Division for Public Education. I'm pleased to turn the program over to John. John.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim, and thanks for that excellent setup to the discussion. You mentioned the notion of the ideas and reality of our topic, and that's certainly what we're going to hope to discuss in some detail over the course of the next hour or so. First, let me add my welcome to the list of those who've been welcoming you on behalf of the Wilson Center and on behalf of our CEO, Director, and President, Jane Harman, who unfortunately was pulled away. And sorry about that, Jim. But she sends her regards. The ABA is near and dear to her. As once a lawyer, always a lawyer, I suppose is it. And so Jane always feels part of the club and is always very thrilled that the ABA collaborates with the Wilson Center. And once again, we are thrilled to be here. The folks at the ABA always put together a stellar panel, and they've done no less this year. And so I think we're going to have a lot of fun discussing a really heady topic that is more complicated as we dive into it than it might appear at first on the surface. So I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to the panel from your left to right. You have the lengthier bios in your programs, and also some interesting quotes and questions that we're going to be framing our discussion around. So please, if you haven't picked up a program, make sure you do on your way out. From your left to right, joining us is Roger Clegg. Roger is President and General Counsel of the Center for Equal Opportunity. Also with us, Aurelian Creatu is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Tocqueville Program at Indiana University in beautiful Bloomington. We were talking about that right before we began this program. Also joining us, Henrik Call Me Rick Hertzberg, who is a staff writer for The New Yorker and a board member for First Vote. Also with us, Claudia Lopez Guerra, a research professor with the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics in Mexico City. And finally, Janae Nelson is a professor of law and associate dean for faculty scholarship at St. John's University School of Law. Please welcome our panel to the discussion. You know, there are so many ways to begin this and very few to end it, because we probably could speak about this for hours. But what I wanted to, when we were having our discussions in preparation for this panel, the question rose that I'm sure is in your minds as well about how absolute a concept this is, universal suffrage. And so that's what I want. Is anybody on this panel arguing for completely universal suffrage with no qualifiers? Or is everyone thinking there are some things, whether it be age limits or some other designations that would limit it? And let's, just for fun, let's go in reverse order of introductions. And so, Janae, you get first shot at this. Are you really talking about universal suffrage, or are we talking about something less than universal?
Well, first, let me say thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's exciting to be here, and I want to thank Jane and James and the Wilson Center for having me. Pauline. You ask whether we mean unrestricted suffrage when we say universal suffrage. I think we can consider that in a number of different ways. So, assuming that there are no limitations at all, there are ways in which we can have proxies, we can have agents on behalf of those who we traditionally exclude. So, for example, minors, right, folks under 18. There's certainly been a movement to suggest that parents and other guardians can vote on behalf of children if we thought that would be the proper way to go. So I think when we say that we should perhaps consider, and it sounds sort of ludicrous, to remove all barriers, I think there are ways in which we could do that structurally that wouldn't in fact seem so absurd if we considered it very carefully and came up with the right protocols and safeguards. But I think there's so much more work to do with the population that is over 18, that are citizens, that are persons who would traditionally have the right to vote under the qualifications that we all typically accept, and who nonetheless are disenfranchised. And so I think if we start there, that would be a good starting point to expand suffrage in this country.
Okay, thanks. Claudio.
Well, I also want to thank the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today. What would absolute universal suffrage mean? You know, just to try to elucidate your own question. Well, some people have argued that actually suffrage should be unlimited, even going beyond boundaries. So the most absolute inclusive principle would be something like including all those who are relevantly or potentially relevantly affected by the decisions of a polity. So under that conception of universal suffrage, well, most people around the world would have the right to vote for the decision makers in the United States, because United States policy often affects the interests of other people. So, you know, the answer to the question you present depends on how we understand absolute universal suffrage. Certainly I don't defend that extreme position, but some people do think that we have to consider it seriously if the principle is that we have to take into account the interests of those who are affected by the decisions and include them on that basis. Now, although I don't want to, I don't defend that understanding of universal suffrage, I do think that the right to vote is restricted in ways today that are hard to defend. And in that sense, I think it should be more universal than it currently is in most places. I disagree with the disenfranchisement of felons. I don't think there are good reasons for denying them the right to vote, although this doesn't mean that we should go ahead and establish voting booths in every prison in the world, because there are relevant practical considerations that would that tell against doing that, even though this doesn't mean that they should be disenfranchised. I also disagree with the current limit of the voting age in terms of considering it at 18 years old, and with the disenfranchisement of persons with mental impairments, as many countries do, others don't. I also think that the disenfranchisement of foreigners who are permanent residents in a polity is also hard to justify. So in these respects, I think, of course, I am looking forward to having a conversation about the basis for making these. I'm just stating my position, but I certainly think there are many good arguments for defending the views that I've just mentioned. And at the same time, I think that in some respects, the right to vote should be less universal than it currently is, in the following sense. Many countries allow permanent expatriates to cast ballots in their home country, even if they've lived abroad for 20 years.
Permanent expatriates. Yes.
Permanent, yeah, people who are...
never coming back.
Right. I mean, persons who are permanent residents in other countries, I don't think they should be allowed to vote, or to frame it differently, I don't think they are wronged if they are disenfranchised. So, just to conclude,
okay.
The right to vote is interesting in the following sense. It is at the same time the most emblematic right in modern democracy, as you just said. But at the same time, it is the one that we have thought about less systematically. If you think about it, I mean, you can go to any library and you will find entire libraries written about the right to political freedom of speech, for instance. What are the limits of this right? What are the foundations of this right? But there is nothing like that regarding the right to vote. We still have much work to do in that regard, and I think that if we take the right to vote seriously and think critically about it, we might realize that many of the exclusions that we take for granted to be justified are not in fact justified, and that some that we think that are justified might be hard to defend.
Okay. And while we're talking universal suffrage, and that'll take us some time to figure out, but I want to advocate for universal welcoming, and I did forget one group, and that's the people joining us via the magic of the World Wide Web. So those of you on the webcast, welcome to the Wilson Center as well. And with that, Rick, back to you. How universal is universal where you're sitting?
Well, I think I guess I'd be for age limits of some sort, not 18. I'd be for 18 for presidential elections, congressional elections, national elections, and probably 16 for local elections. And I also think that resident aliens People who are living here, they should be able to vote in local elections too. That's how they do it in Sweden, a country from which we can always learn something. I think it would be nice if we had if we had a right to vote. That's something the Constitution left out. And although there are, in some articles there's an implication that that there's a right to vote, where it says here and there that you can't be denied the right to vote for this reason or that. It would be an awfully good thing to have an explicit constitutional provision giving the right to vote, like the right to speak freely or the right to pack a gun. And if that were the case, I think we would see, we might see a bit less of the current attempts to disfranchise large numbers of people for no good reason.
And what you're talking about is what's commonly referred to as voter suppression.
That's right. And voter suppression is just the flip side of the ancient kind of political corruption, where you vote people and where you vote dead people. People who are dead vote. This is a case where people who are living are denied the right to, are denied the vote, but it amounts to the same thing. It's the same. It's the same exercise in bad faith and corruption.
Okay, Aurelian?
I'd like to echo what Rick said. The right to vote has never been formally enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. We have the right to bear arms, but not the right to participate in elections in the text. And I think that it's not until the 1868, with the passage of the 14th Amendment, right, that the phrase right to vote appeared in the federal constitution. And I think that the fact that the state constitutions were left to decide how to make voting an affirmative right allowed them to exclude or define who the people are. Because when we talk about universal suffrage, we talk about the dogma or the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people. So that looks very well on paper, but who defines how the people is to be defined and understood remains an open question. And the ways in which the people have been defined over time has carried out many restrictive connotations. I also want to point out that for me, the concept, as a political theorist, the concept of universal suffrage is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a fully democratic order. I think this is what we care about here. In what ways extending the franchise can allow us to live in a more democratic and open society. And it's clear, I think, from examining the history of the last 2 centuries, that no political system can claim to be democratic without a form of universal suffrage, with the exceptions that my co-panelists have pointed out. But a broad franchise alone, how broad remains to be seen, even that cannot guarantee democracy. There are other ways of political participation beyond voting that I think are relevant. And I would also like to point out that the language of capacity, that historically speaking has been the other way of looking at voting, at participating in politics, has not fully disappeared from our life. It's not in politics. We don't require property qualification or a freehold requirement to participate. But when we look at some professions, look at the lawyers here. To be a lawyer, you need a certain degree, you need a certain qualification. So the language of capacity has remained kind of sotto voce in the debates, and I think that we need to acknowledge that. It's not democratic fully, it's based on capacity. I should also point out, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss that we talk about the right to vote, we talk about elections, but the really democratic form of selecting leaders has been lottery, traditionally speaking, in ancient Greece, but also in the Italian republics. The real democratic element is lottery, selecting leaders by lottery, not by election. Elections were seen in the history of political thought as creating a new aristocracy of representatives. And there is a little bit of that in the current debate about the elite in Washington, for example, as disengaged or separated from the voters at the local level. So the real democratic mode of election is lottery, not election.
So 317 million names in a fishbowl. And pick one.
We can talk about that.
That's going to be some election night coverage. Roger, I don't know if it's an advantage or disadvantage to go last on an opening question. You have a lot to react to, but I'd rather keep you focused on the initial question about your thoughts on the notion of what do we mean by universal? We use the term, but I haven't heard anyone advocate for 100% everybody gets to vote. Janae came the closest. She at least gave some theoretical scenarios of how you might achieve that. But everybody else was willing to entertain certain restrictions.
Yeah, and I agree with I think all the restrictions that were elucidated. I don't think children should vote. I don't think people who are mentally incompetent should vote. I don't think that non-citizens should vote. And I don't think that people who've been convicted of serious crimes should vote. Certainly not when they're in prison, and not until after they've served their sentences and shown that they've turned over a new leaf. I think that, and we can talk about why this is the case, but I think that we have certain minimum objective standards of responsibility and commitment to our laws that we expect people to have if they're to be entrusted in the solemn enterprise of self-government. And people in those categories don't meet those minimum qualifications.
Okay. Then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask each of you a specific question and then have the others react at some point with answers. But I'll ask that those of you who are reacting keep your comments fairly brief. You'll have your opportunity when you ask a question to expand a bit. Because you can see the problem here, just by our opening salvo, there's so much to talk about. And the reality is we're not going to have a neat, tidy package at the end of our time. We're going to run out of time with still some unresolved questions. And so it's just the nature of a big topic. Let me begin with you, Aurelian, about this notion. One of the quotes from the program: "At its birth, the United States was not a democratic nation. Far from it. The very word democracy has pejorative overtones." That's from Alexander Caesar, and it matches up with some of the things we were talking about in our opening discussions, that this concept of universal suffrage is not timeless. So what I want to get a sense from you is, when does it become embraced almost globally as a universal goal? Because when you look at the origins of the United States, that certainly wasn't the priority. So at what point in world history and U.S. history, is there some tipping point or some moment you could point to where a discussion of universal suffrage can happen just about in any country in the world?
You mentioned, John, Caesar's excellent book, which is called The Right to Vote, The Contest History of Democracy in the United States. And I think Caesar shows there are four periods in the U.S. history that are relevant for this. The first one would be 1787 through 1850, which includes the Constitution Convention and the development of the political parties there. And then the 1914, which includes both the Civil War and Reconstruction era. And then there's a third period, 1914, 1960, and then what follows after 1960s with the voting rights and so forth. But I do have to point out, in response to your question, that democracy was seen not always as the best form of government. There was always an equation of democracy with mob rule, and this goes back to Plato's Republic, right? That the best, you need expert people making decisions rather than the mob, rather than the people. So it took a long time, I think, in the history of ideas, for people to come to terms with the values of democracy. And even if one reads the Federalist Papers, for example, one sees that there is a distrust of direct democracy. You need a form of representative government or representative democracy that is supposed to bring to the fore the most capable, the natural aristocracy, as it were. And this is a term that Jefferson used, right? That you need in every society, especially in a democratic society, a natural aristocracy that is not based on property qualifications. So I think that the crucial time remains, I think, the late 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. And that's when the standard conception of democracy is there. But there's a distinction between democracy in the social condition, in the morals, in the customs, in the social fabric, and democracy at the political level. And this is a distinction that Alexis de Tocqueville made in Democracy in America. He points out that democracy as a social condition existed even in Europe, but what European countries did not have was the political democracy, which means, among other things, political equality. And it is not a coincidence, I think, that it is in America that the property qualifications and other tax-paying requirements were lowered and abolished before the European countries. So there is this period at the end of the 18th century, the transatlantic revolutions, when I think democracy sheds the bad odor that it had before in America, but less so in Europe. So it took, I would say, another half a century or more in Europe for people to come to terms with the concept of political democracy, not only social democracy.
Any thoughts? Rick? Yes.
I just want to object to the notion that the framers were against democracy. When they used that word, then they meant the Athenian style of rule by a popular assembly. That's direct democracy. Nobody was for direct democracy. When the framers said they wanted a republic, they meant a democratic republic. They meant a representative government. That's what we all mean. And when you hear somebody say now, well, the wisdom of the framers is we're a republic, not a democracy, they're up to no good when they say that. And I'd also warn against too great an idolatry of the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were op-ed pieces written in a particular moment to sell a particular political compromise. The authors often wrote things in the Federalist Papers that they did not believe and did not agree with because they were selling this compromise that they thought was better than the alternative, which was nothing, or the Articles of Confederation. So don't believe everything you read in the Federalist Papers. Those high-minded reasons that are given, for example, for the system of electing the president or for the composition of the Senate, those hide an awful lot of truth. And you shouldn't pay too much attention to them.
So you're suggesting some elitist formula to save us from ourselves?
No, on the contrary, no.
No?
I'm suggesting.
No, I mean, you're not suggesting that, but you're saying that's what, don't take this stuff when they're representative or how we pick a president. You're saying that people are trying to control it in a way that because you don't trust the masses? Did I misunderstand what you said?
No,
I'm sorry.
I do trust the masses, and I think the framers trusted the masses too. I just mean that when they...
Then what's the no good there that you're suggesting? I guess that's what I'm not...
good about...
You said they're up to no good.
I know, I say people now who will say, well, we can't reform the Electoral College, or we shouldn't think about extending the franchise because the framers were against mob rule. They said they didn't like democracy. Those are the ones who are up to no good.
And what's the no good they're up to?
The no good is to suppress the vote. The no good is to...
For partisan political outcomes?
Virtually always, yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, who else wants to chime in on this before we move on to another question? Anyone else? Okay. Then I'm going to move to another question. And Rick, I'm going to stick with you about this then. Based on your first two answers, the question I was going to ask you initially was, how close are we to mission accomplished in terms of universal suffrage? And I pretty much should throw that question out, and I think we know that you don't think we're very close.
Yeah, and I don't think it's so much about who has the right to vote or voter suppression. I think that universal suffrage really ought to include having a shot, having at least an even chance of voting in a meaningful election, in a contested election. And that's where we fall horrendously short in this country.
So in the scenario where in the presidential election, you're voting in a state where before you get up in the morning, you know who your state's going to support.
That's right. Or if you live in any of the
that?
350 congressional districts that we know right now what the result is going to be, and it makes no difference if you vote in any of those
Less
districts.
turnover in the U.S. Congress than in the old Russian Politburo.
Because they drank more vodka and ate more fatty food.
Well, that would explain it. But how do you change that equation? What is the mechanism?
Well, you can. There's a mechanism to change it in the presidential election, to change it without touching a word of the Constitution. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the National Popular Vote movement that would guarantee the presidency to whoever gets the most votes in all 50 states, and do it without any change in the Constitution. It's a little harder to do it in the case of the legislatures, the state legislatures, and the Senate and the House, because we seem to be stuck with single-member district elections. You know, if the framers had written the Constitution in 1860 or 1870, we would have had some kind of proportional representation. That's what countries that have designed their democracies in modern times, that's what they always choose. They never choose our system of single-member districts for their legislatures.
Okay. Any comments on this notion of how close we are to mission accomplished? And
Well,
I know, how would you gauge it? In other words, if we were all white male landowners who only voted at one point in our history and now we're something else, how close are we to a place that you would feel comfortable with in terms of universal suffrage as a goal or as an ideal?
Well, I think Rick's right to point out that we need to measure this in two different ways, right? So one is who is in fact entitled to vote.
Yes.
Right? And we've certainly made significant strides in expanding the categories and even numbers of individuals who can cast a ballot. But if we look at what that translates into and whether that's meaningful participation in a democracy, I still think we have a very long way to go. The history of universal suffrage is still being written, and we really won't know the outcome for some time yet. And in fact, we've moved forward in fits and starts. We've made U-turns. We've reverted to practices that I would not have forecast that we would continue to pursue in this country, like voter ID laws, like restricting voters based on time limits for casting ballots and so forth. So we have a long way to go in a great many respects, and we can't measure it solely by the increase in categories of persons. We've certainly made significant strides, but there's a great deal of room to fulfill the full promise of democracy.
No, I agree with both of the previous comments that we face, not only in the United States you face, but also in other countries we face all over the world, significant challenges in order to guarantee an equal and effective opportunity for every enfranchised person to vote. So that's definitely a problem, and I understand that, I don't want to, deny the significance of that problem, but I do think that we still have a long way to go in terms of who ought to be allowed to cast a ballot, not only in terms of the opportunity to, vote, but also in terms of disenfranchisement proper. So in that sense, just to insist on what I said in my first intervention, it's interesting because, when more than half of the population were disenfranchised, when women weren't allowed to vote, some racial minorities and other, large segments of the population, well, enfranchisement was the most important topic of political reform in the 19th and 20th century. But now that, only the groups that continue to be disenfranchised are minorities, we don't pay that much attention. But that doesn't mean that their disenfranchisement is not that important. We're still talking about millions of people when we talk about felons or the mentally impaired, or reducing the voting age from 18 to 14, for instance, or foreigners who are permanent residents. So I still think I think these are important categories that separate us from still being. I don't know if this is the time, but I would like to address, since it's clear that Roger and I disagree on this. I mean, I would like to offer some of the reasons and considerations behind,
Sure, we'll get to that in a minute, but
Okay.
first Roger wanted to comment on the discussion that was ensuing here. We'll give it a shot at that, and then I want to come back to you with a question that relates to this.
Sure, and I look forward to that, Claudia. Well, I was just going to make the point that, John, you were using the phrase, mission accomplished, and I do want to say that I think we have to be careful about approaching this area in that way. I mean, I'm a great fan of Edmund Burke, and I think that it's a mistake to sit down and say, okay, well, I have this blueprint of principles that I have deduced in my head that make for the ideal state, and I'm going to now go out and try to bend reality, change reality so that it fits in with these principles. I think that the right way to go about governance is not that way. It's much more practical. It's looking to see, what works. Now, that's not to say that we don't have principles, and that when principles are being violated, that shouldn't, give us pause and cause us to rethink, the way that we do things. This is not an argument for never changing, but it is an argument, I think, for being careful about changing.
Roger, is there something specific you're thinking about now when you say about things that won't work, even though we're in pursuit of an ideal, but we can't be reckless because there are things? Is there anything specific that we've talked about that you had in mind of a proposal that someone has made or that's on the table that you say wouldn't work?
Well, I mean, I think that if you say that, well, we need to figure out a way so that, you know, every human being, you know, has a way to have, you know, equal political power to, you know, to affect elections or whatever. I think that that's not the right way to go about it. I mean, for instance, you know, Rick mentioned this, you know, popular vote thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, I think, you know, reasonable people can differ on this, but, you know, I look at the United States and I feel that, you know, this is the greatest country in the history of the world, and that before we start making radical changes in how presidents are elected, we should ask ourselves, well, you know, are we really that unhappy with the way things have gone for the last 200 years? When we don't know exactly what the result will be, you know, if we, you know, throw out the current system and put in something that seems more consistent with, you know, a particular set of you know, ready-made principles.
Is there a problem you would identify that you believe does rise to the level of action that would not be reckless or messing with?
Oh, well,
if it's not
listen,
broke,
you know,
don't fix it?
I think that, you know, generally the enfranchisement over the last 200 years of more and more people makes a lot of sense. But, you know, I would justify it in more practical terms. I would say that, well, there's sort of two reasons when you think about it why we should have sort of a presumption that everybody should vote. You know, one is that if you're bossing around people, then the people you're bossing around should have some say in the matter. You know, it's taxation without representation, you know, and all that. I think that makes sense. The other is, you know, to quote William F. Buckley, that, you know, he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than by the Harvard faculty. And I think he was right with that. And I think that that's the other reason, that, you know, the reason that having a lot of voters makes sense is because, you know, the many are wise and the few are not. It's very difficult to figure out who the people are that we're going to limit the vote to. It's much safer. It's sort of like, you know, when you invest, you divest in a wide variety because you don't really know for sure, you know, which particular stock is going to do well. Well, I think voting is sort of the same way. That there are a lot of people out there who have, you know, everybody has a valuable, you know, perspective, and, you know, by and large, and, you know, we want their input in figuring out what to do. So now, having stated those two principles, I think that, you know, you can see that there are limits, you know, on them. If you know, on the first one, you know, you know, if people are being bossed around, then they have, you know, should have a say in it. Well, you know, if you're not being bossed around because you're not doing, you know, you're not following the laws, then I think it's harder to claim that you have a right to make the laws for everyone else. You know, and likewise, you know, while the many are wise and the few are not, you know, there are limits to that. You know, 4-year-olds are not wise. Mentally incapacitated people are not wise. So. Anyway, I've gone.
Claudio, you mentioned earlier that maybe even citizenship shouldn't be considered when it comes to voting. And in this area, a lot of things that we value or believe in are on the table under the umbrella we've used of universal suffrage. But we've expanded it to talk about other things, like what's meaningful participation in a democracy, where voting may not really represent that. So it's more, it's thicker than just the act of voting itself, which could be seen as thin in certain circumstances. And you mentioned citizenship. I would like you to tell us what would be the case for expanding the vote to people who don't reside within a country or within a district or wherever, however far you would take this concept.
I don't defend that. For extending the right to vote for people who do
I know,
not
I know you
reside.
said personally it's not necessary, but you mentioned it as
that some people,
a theory that's out there. So I'm asking you to represent it because you're familiar with it.
So the idea basically is that the decisions that are made in certain polities or be them national or local local polities, states or municipal governments, have significant impact on on the lives and persons of other places. And to that extent, if we take the democratic principle seriously, that all those who are relevantly affected by a decision should have a say in that decision, according to that idea, then those who are relevantly affected by the decisions of one polity who live in another polity should be allowed to have a say in those decisions.
Is there any significant movement, a movement backing up that sort of idea? Or is
Not
this,
really.
is this really just the thought idea?
This is basically
thought
just
experiment?
in you know, some political theories and
Yeah.
philosophers in trying to figure out how extensive the franchise should be, have proposed this principle, the principle of affected interests, as the basis for allocating the right to vote. So all those who are relevantly affected.
Be difficult to determine on it, but I really on
I think there is a historical precedent here. In the 19th century America, some states, I think Illinois was one of them around the 1830s, 1840s, granted the right to vote to aliens who declared their intent to naturalize.
state by state. This was
State by
done.
state. There were a few states, and I think they were quickly followed by other states in the Midwest. I'm pretty sure about Wisconsin and Illinois. So I think that example can be
But
followed.
aliens live in the country. They're members
aliens
of the
who
community.
immigrate and declared their intention
Right,
to
but
become
they're
citizens.
part of the polity in the sense that they live
Absolutely.
there, they pay taxes there. But this is a more radical principle. So according to this other principle, those, say for instance, well, Mexicans, I'm from Mexico, would be allowed to vote in the United States on the grounds that the policies, economic policies, immigration policies, and all sorts of laws and decisions that are made here have relevant implications for Mexicans and for people all over the world. So on the basis of that principle, everyone would be voting everywhere.
I agree. If I understand correctly, I think the European Union offers a model for that as well today, right? In the 27 member countries, for the elections of the MPs in Brussels, you can have a say that actually is not limited to where you live, but it's coextensive with the territory of the Union.
Now,
No, I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
so that's kind of interesting philosophically to consider. But the relevant point that you raise with your question has to do with citizenship as a relevant condition for enfranchisement. And there are two cases that are, relevant that have to do with that. I mean, not everyone voting everywhere, but the enfranchisement of non-resident citizens and the enfranchisement of resident non-citizens, right? These are real problems in many countries. There have been huge debates in many immigrant-sending polities on whether those who live permanently abroad should cast ballots in their home country. And as you know well, here and in Europe, there has been a lot of discussion regarding the enfranchisement of permanent residents who are not citizens. Now, the question is precisely, is citizenship a relevant condition for having the right to vote? And I want to say no. Why would it be a relevant condition? Well, let us think about it this way. When a person comes here and establishes himself or herself as a legal resident, they acquire relevant rights on the basis of meeting certain conditions associated to those rights. Not only certain kinds of civil rights, but also some political rights. So, for instance, I was a student here. I did my PhD at Columbia University, and during that time, I don't think there was a legal restriction for me to speak publicly about politics. I actually did a PhD in political science, so I wrote and spoke about political affairs. So I did have one of the most significant political rights, the right to freedom of speech. And I also had the right to political association. And I also had many other rights, simply on the basis of having met the relevant conditions for acquiring those rights, which in the United States, well, implied just being here a legal resident who, was, for a certain purpose, conducting my life in this place, and the state was forced to treat me in certain ways, that involved the respect of these basic rights. So the question is, what is special about the right to vote that would distinguish it from other political rights, such as political right of association and speech, that we automatically grant those other political rights, but not the franchise? So what is special about, well, the franchise and citizenship that but that we wouldn't give it upon meeting, relevant conditions such as just being here, paying taxes, being a member of society. So in the end, I don't think being recognized as a formal member of the state, acquiring the nationality, is ultimately a relevant condition. What is a relevant condition is just being governed by the government in question. It's being here, suffering the effects of laws and policies like everyone else, being subject to the decisions of policymakers like everyone else, paying taxes like everyone else, well, simply being a person in the community like everyone else.
Janae, I want to. Can we have something that we can call democracy if we don't have universal suffrage? And with an asterisk, because we've clearly made various cases here today that universal suffrage doesn't mean every living entity has some say at the ballot box.
Well, suffrage is really a tool, right? That's what we're ultimately saying, is that it's a tool to achieve and to enhance democracy. It's a way in which we can affect the forces of society that will govern us and potentially impact policy beyond our borders, even as we've all mentioned, that there are these intersectionalities and really a globalization of interests here. You cannot, I think, in this modern era, have a functioning democracy without universal suffrage. And we've already identified the different ways in which we might define universal suffrage. But just as a general concept, I can't see a way in which it would function that would meet modern standards without universal suffrage. Now, we can be much more creative, I think, in the way that we conceive of this. And Claudia was just talking about non-citizen voting. For example, in New York, where I live, up until the Bloomberg administration got rid of the Department of Education, we had non-citizens voting in school board elections for 40 years without any brouhaha, right? With very little fanfare, because they were, as you mentioned, tax-paying persons. They had children attending schools in those districts. They had an interest. And that's really what we try to use citizenship as, right? A proxy for interest. It's some sort of stakeholder identifier. And it doesn't necessarily need to be citizenship to establish that. But getting back to the notion of whether universal suffrage is essential to democracy, I can't imagine a democracy that we would respect if we look internationally at emerging democracies and what really is the hallmark of a truly stable democracy. Universal suffrage has to be a component of that.
You know, those who become citizens later in life have to pass a test. Those who move here and go through the whole process need to pass a test to become citizens. If you're grandfathered in by being born here, you don't have to know anything about your Constitution to cast the vote or to claim citizenship. And there's a quote from no less a thinker than John Stuart Mill in the materials: "Universal teaching must precede universal enfranchisement." If there's a conflict between the two, he said, teach first and then vote later. Roger, I want to ask you about this notion. Should there be some competency involved in voting, some proven competency? You said earlier that people who are mentally impaired should not be allowed to vote. But how do you test that? Mental impairment is not a singular condition. There are different levels of that. So how far do we go with this notion?
Yeah, well, not very far. I mean, I think you've got to be, catatonic or something like that, or I'm not in favor.
Which does describe a certain percentage of the electorate, I believe.
I'm not in favor of literacy tests or even quiz tests like those that are required in order to become citizens for people who are already here. One reason I give for that is we haven't done that, and things have worked pretty well. Another reason is that, the reason we basically let people vote is because we get better government that way. We want to have input from a lot of people. I don't think that, I'm not prepared to say that, people who, can't name a majority of the justices on the Supreme Court off the tops of their heads, don't have something meaningful to contribute to elections. I think that
this room could do that.
Yeah, probably so.
An ABA crowd could do that.
I think that the question is really, one question is whether the people that we're allowing to vote have the best interest of the rest of us at heart, the best interest of the country at heart. That's why I was sort of intrigued by your example, of people who are non-citizens but who send their children to schools. I mean, I could understand, I'm not sure I would favor this, but I could understand saying that, well, somebody like that ought to be allowed to vote in school board elections because we trust them to have the interests of, everybody in the school. Their interests are the same as ours. Now, do we want people who are non-citizens voting for President of the United States? Well, then there is more of a question about whether, somebody who's not an American citizen has the interests of the rest of us at heart. So I could see drawing the line there and saying that, well, we let them vote in this election, but not in that election.
Can I respond for a moment? Well, I always get nervous when we talk about how someone will vote and what their interests are and what morality might lie beneath the vote. And I think it's a very, very dangerous proposition to suggest that if my interests are not aligned with yours or not aligned with what we think are the interests that prevail in society, that I should be denied the right to vote. It seems to contradict what you said in terms of ensuring that we have a diversity of voices informing our governance. And if we have some filter to decide, well, which are the good diverse voices and which aren't, then we are undermining that very proposition.
Well, what I'm hearing too is I don't hear about a filter. I hear just suspicion based on nation of origin or some other superficial trait, right? Because how could you ever
also
determine?
Plays into the felon disenfranchisement argument too, which I think is probably a little closer to home. That we suspect that these people, by virtue of having broken the social contract, right, are no longer worthy of voting, and they don't represent the interests of broader society, and therefore have no value in democracy. And I would argue those are people we certainly want to hear from. If we are all part of a demos and these individuals cannot uphold their terms or they're part of the social contract bargain, I'd like to know why. I'd like to know if perhaps there is some indicator, particularly when we look at the demographic concentration of the persons who are disenfranchised, largely African American, largely people of lower socioeconomic status. If those people are perpetually failing to meet the social contract, then those are the voices that I think we need to hear from to know how we might improve our democracy so that doesn't happen.
There are other ways that people can speak, though, without voting. I'm not saying that these people should be silenced or shouldn't have First Amendment rights. I'm just saying that they shouldn't be making the laws if they're not willing to follow them.
Which is why you want to put it in the Constitution, voting as a right, like free speech or like right to own a...
No, the main reason I would want to put it in the Constitution now is because then it would be a lot harder to do voter suppression.
Yeah.
Just like it's harder to do speech suppression because we've got a First Amendment.
That's a very good argument.
There's still, we've talked for almost an hour and we still have barely scratched the surface in many ways of so many other aspects of this discussion, and we do want to include you in it. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask each of you, in order of introduction, to take 2 minutes to either tell us, we still have some time and we're going to take audience questions, but tell us what you think the major takeaway ought to be for someone considering this question of universal suffrage, or in your 2 minutes, is there something that we haven't talked about yet that we may not get to through audience questions that you think is really important and you wouldn't feel good about leaving here not having mentioned it? So those are sort of the things, and I'll give you a second to think about it while I do some logistics work out here. And Matt, are we going to have some people with microphones on either end? Okay, so we'll get our mic holders in place, and we'll go through our panel, and then we will turn to you for your questions and comments. And Roger, we begin with you in order of introduction.
I think I'll just make one point, which is that, and this I think builds on something that Janae was talking about, that I think it makes sense to talk about suffrage in terms of actually voting. But I think that Janae was saying that we can actually sort of broaden that to include other ways in which political power is exercised. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind here, that there are a lot of other ways that political power can be exercised in a democracy rather than voting, and I think that that's important, for a couple of reasons. I do think that the framers, were wisely, reluctant to make things too mechanical and to have, not to have some mechanisms to ensure greater deliberation and more sort of nuanced input from different interests than simply the ballot box. And I think that that's important. And here again, I think that I'm very Burkean in my unwillingness to radically change the way that people exercise their power, in a democracy. And this gets into things like, campaign finance and lobbying, and the division of powers that we have and the separation of powers. I think that all those things, again, have worked very well to make this a great country and a country where there is, a lot of freedom. It's not to say it's not perfect, not to say that it can't be improved, but I think we have to be very careful about making radical changes in light of the successes that we've had.
Okay, thank you, Aurelian.
I think the concept of the right to vote, in my view, should be seen in the larger framework of discussions about democracy. As long as we focus on the techniques of voting, the written ballot, the secret ballot, the districting, the apportionment, which we haven't talked about, the structure for representation, the financing of campaigns, all of this, I think, are equally important. I wouldn't say more important than enfranchising people, which is fundamental. I agree with all the panelists here. But I think that unless we talk about all of these issues, and I'm very concerned about the redistricting as a practice that has made most of the elections not competitive in this country. I think that this is a larger conversation that includes the right of suffrage, but only as a part of it. But I want to go back to my original point, which is, and it's a challenge to all of you. I say, why should we have elections rather than lottery? I'm not pushing for lottery, but this is a thought experiment. Let me give you two arguments here why elections are not the unconditional good that we think. First of all, they are very costly. Think about how much money is being spent on elections today. I'm talking about presidential elections, I'm talking about local elections, any kind of
As we
elections.
speak, because now the elections are endless.
You can't even submit your name for consideration unless you raise, I don't know, $60,000 a day or something like this. It's obscene. So very costly. They are not impartial. When voters cast a ballot, voters are not supposed to be partial. You are supposed to be partial. On the contrary, you like someone's face, you like someone's voice, you like someone's religion, or you dislike all of this. So impartiality is not there, and this is a criterion that I think is very important. Thirdly, elections are not meritocratic. We know that elections do not bring to the fore the best. In America, Tocqueville, in Democracy in America, says very clearly, Americans do not elect the best to positions of power. The best, the most talented go into business, law, but not into politics. And I think that we need to look into this. Why not having a combination of elections and lottery at the local level in particular? The size has been invoked as an argument against using lottery, and the fact that we are a diverse population. And we cannot count on homogeneity of interest that was alluded to earlier as a condition for people exercising responsible citizenship. But the size at the local level is not a consideration against practicing lottery. So I think we would save a lot of money if we didn't have elections. We'd just draw and we would use that money to educate people, to teach them foreign languages, to teach them civic education and other things.
Can you opt out, or do you have to have your name in the Fishman thing? What if you don't want to serve?
I don't argue for lottery, but I just want to point out that we don't talk about it, and I think we should.
It's sort of fun to think about.
Well, we already use it in jury trials.
And the jury trials, yeah, absolutely.
And I would be all for it. For example, I'd like to see if we ever to have a constitutional convention, I'd like to see it done by lottery. I'm always impressed when I'm on a jury with how seriously people take it. It's a bit much to ask to actually fill all the offices that way. But for making once in a generation decisions that the whole society needs to make, yeah, I'd be for that. I want to say too that the problem we have a problem with that's not just redistricting. That is a big problem, but it's really rooted in districting itself. So I want to repeat that. And on this point of your point, Aurelian, about we don't elect the best, and Tocqueville's point too, I've noticed that when I meet European legislators, members of the German Parliament or the French National Assembly, they seem to be of a higher quality on the whole than ours. And I think one reason for that is that because of the local basis of representation rather than the national basis, that the real get up and go people tend to leave podunk and go to the metropolis in almost every field. But that doesn't work in politics. In politics, you've got to stay in podunk, and you've got to play up to all the local realtors and lawyers and so forth. I'd like to see room in our system, as there is room in other systems, for some portion, in addition to those local representatives, to have some portion of the national legislature chosen by a national electorate. That's what you have in a lot of other countries, and you do get a much more varied blend of people, and in general a higher quality, but people who are much more accomplished and intelligent than we get.
And Podunk is a small town in France, correct?
Podunk, I live there too.
Claudio.
Okay, so I would make my last point somewhat in opposition to Roger, like the exact opposite point. I think you could make...
Some tension there.
Just to make this fun, right? You could make that argument at every single point in time where the franchise was extended to the major groups, right? So let's enfranchise women. No, wait a minute. America is the greatest country in the world. It was true at the time. Let's enfranchise African Americans. No, we shouldn't, do that. Why, how do you say, meddle with the electoral system?
John Adams, I'll let you continue, but worth reading. No end to it. It is dangerous to open so fruitful a source of controversy and altercation as would be opened by attempting to alter the qualifications of voters. There will be no end of it. New claims will arise. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights not enough attended to. And every man who has not a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state.
Right. So the point is that you could have made this same argument, right? But we certainly, in retrospect, I mean, we would have said, we would say now today, I hope, that was wrong. Women should have been enfranchised, and we're all happy that they were, even though things were going well. So on the basis of what considerations should we think about making changes to the electorate? Well, just thinking seriously about this matter as another instance of institutional design. I mean, I think we have to take into account serious arguments and serious evidence, and then if the arguments and the evidence are compelling enough, then we should go ahead and do these changes. So let me just give some examples. I mean, it's just, for me, it's not enough just to say, well, you've broken the law, you have no right to make the law. Well, raise your hand if there is one person here who has never broken the law. I mean, we've all broken some law at some point. So, I mean, what's the connection? Then voting is not legislating. When we vote, we elect the decision makers. We elect representatives. And people in jail have probably a greater interest in having good representatives than people who are not in jail, in the sense that they're in a position of vulnerability that is extreme. They're subject to the extreme power of the state, and their basic human rights and basic standards of living are at stake, and they should be allowed to have a say in who is administering the conditions in which they live. And just in one final example, in relation to this, again, just look at the question of evidence that I mentioned. Well, here in the United States, you have a great natural experiment. Some states allow felons to vote, others don't. There is no single piece of evidence suggesting that the states where felons are allowed to vote are in any way worse than the others. I mean, there's no single connection in terms of, showing that felons vote for worse candidates or that they vote for co-felon politicians. Well, many of them are felons, but not because
the interesting
felons
thing is,
elect
whatever
them.
example any of you use, what we say, as far as quality, the outcome stays about the same.
Right. So if there's no evidence that things get worse, then I mean that to me, and given the interest felons do have in voting and in political participation, I mean, let's do it. And one final example has to do, I mean, could go on, but with respect to the enfranchisement of persons who have a certain kind of mental impairment, do I agree with you that there are some persons that couldn't possibly make a reasonable vote? Of course. And would they be wrong if they're disfranchised? No. However, as a matter of institutional design, since we don't have an instrument to identify them precisely, we have to determine what to do as a society, given that some of them do have the capacity to vote, and and establishing a blanket disenfranchisement on the basis of mental impairment excludes them, then we have to weight those injustices with the, fair cases. So let me just mention this very brief example. In Canada, you might not know this, but there was a law that was very similar to what happens in most other places, like in the United States. People were disenfranchised the moment they were assigned a guardian or something like that. Many states here in America have something like that. At some point, people started challenging, people who had a mental impairment, challenged in court, okay, I might be impaired, but I still know what voting is and I want to participate, and they started winning their cases in courts. At some point, the problem became national and the parliament had to address the problem, and they simply said at some point, 92, I believe this was, look, we don't have a precise instrument for determining who has lost the capacity to vote in terms of mental impairment. If we're going to make a mistake, let's make it towards favoring those who still have the capacity, and we don't want to unfairly disenfranchisement. So they dropped their requirement. So in Canada, doesn't matter how badly you are in a state of dementia or Alzheimer, you have a legal right to vote, and I don't think anyone...
There's a Mayor Ford here joke that's begging to be told, and I'm going to use restraint. There's Janae here.
Well, I think this really strikes at the heart of how much we believe in popular sovereignty, right? Whether we really trust our fellow citizens or residents to help govern the society that we've chosen to live in, how much we trust each other, right? To help form the policies and laws and elect the officials who will represent us in this democracy. And I think if we believe in the transformative power or potential of democracy, then we also have to believe in a broad construction of universal suffrage. You can't have the former, or the former goes hand in hand with the latter. And I'd like to hear us talk a little bit more about some of the specific limitations on suffrage that we're facing now as a nation, even though that's maybe talking about the thinner and not the thicker concept of universal suffrage. That is at least a threshold, right, to exercising it altogether. So I'd like to hear us talk a little bit more about that. And also the power of the vote as a tool to transform society. We've made such significant strides through the ballot box, and we've talked about different groups who've been previously excluded from the demos and those who are now part of a diverse set of voices. And it's still not diverse enough. And I don't think that we've yet seen the America that would exist if we were fully inclusive of all the diverse perspectives that we have right in our midst, but that we seem to perpetually want to find ways to exclude, be they de jure methods of exclusion or just circumstantial methods. So,
because we don't know, it's unpredictable, we don't screen questions, what will be asked, I don't want us to run out of time without giving you an opportunity to mention something specific in regard to what you just referenced. So if you would name one instance that you think deserves more thought or discussion, what would it be, where disenfranchisement is involved?
well, Claudio did such an excellent job discussing a matter very important to me, which is felon disenfranchisement, so I won't mention that, but I'll give a nod to it. That's something I would mention. Voter ID laws, I think, are extraordinarily problematic, and we've had some recent court cases that would be perfectly relevant to this discussion. And frankly, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't underscore the Supreme Court's decision last week in the Schuette case, which dealt with a proposition, a voter initiative that ultimately amended the Michigan Constitution. And if that doesn't underscore the power of the vote, which I think was in fact wrongly decided by the Supreme Court to allow voters of Michigan to determine what a state could do concerning remedial and measures involving race, gender, et cetera. But the fact that the court allowed voters to essentially ban affirmative action in Michigan tells us all how incredibly important the right to vote is, and how any restrictions on it has enormous repercussions that we can't even begin to imagine.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to turn to you for questions and comments. And a couple of ground rules. We ask that you introduce yourself when you ask a question. And if you have a comment versus a question, we ask that you please keep it brief so we can get to as many of you as possible. And then finally, when you can, I know it's not always possible, you see that I struggle with it sometimes, if you can direct your question to one panelist, the person you think would be best suited, at least for an initial response. It doesn't mean we'll shut everyone else out from commenting, but it'll help us move forward as quickly as possible. So who has a question or comment? Right down here, there are two people right here. We'll start with Philippa, and then move over to the gentleman in the red tie.
Thank you. Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. Thank you all so much. This has really been extraordinarily illuminating, thought-provoking, all of the good things that one wants a discussion to be. John, I'm going to not pay attention to what you said. I hope you'll forgive me and not direct it to one.
No, everyone does it, so that's fine.
Okay, well, I don't want to break that mold. This is not just directed to one person, but to those of you who think that the franchise should be broadened. Could you talk a little bit about who the decision makers should be? I mean, I know you mentioned having a constitutional amendment saying that there should be a right to vote, but presumably that would not be overly specific about, and you shouldn't be denied the right to vote if you're this, or presumably it wouldn't say any adult should have the right to vote. So looking at the examples that have already been given about the extension of the franchise in localities and states, and certainly in the United States, that was how women started to be enfranchised, et cetera. Would you say that there should be simply one federal rule about who has the right to vote? Would you favor experimentation on the state and local levels? How would you go about doing this?
Okay, who'd like to begin? No one. Okay, pass. No, I'm only kidding. Go ahead, Claudio.
No, this is a comment as an outsider, really, in the sense that the United States, I think it's unique in this respect of having local rules for national elections. That's something very difficult to understand for non-Americans. In most countries I know, at least with respect to national elections, there's a national law. They're uniform, they're just unique standards for how, who should vote, how votes should be counted, how votes should be cast, and so on and so forth. So it is very striking to see that here it's different. Of course, there are some constitutional limitations on who may be disenfranchised by the states and so on. But here you have very different local authorities, and I think democracy in places. So let me just to give a little background. So in countries that made a transition from a certain form of authoritarian rule to democracy, one of the big questions was precisely how to guarantee a fair and democratic electoral system, and the only way to do that was precisely to establish uniform rules that were that make their enforcement easier. So I think that's something that wasn't mentioned in the panel, but I think that from those outsiders who look at the electoral system in the United States, that's something that would be number one thing in the agenda, establishing a national electoral authority and national electoral rules that would, guarantee equal treatment to all in the process of casting and counting votes.
Janae, you wanted to say something as well?
For
Yeah, just
national
very briefly, I think the idea of using states as incubators for a variety of laws and practices sounds fantastic, and is usually, one of the benefits that we think we can get out of our federal system. But when I see what states seem to do with that freedom of experimentation, it gives me great pause. And so I can just point to, for example, the states of Arizona and Kansas that are attempting to add to their federal form a requirement for proof of citizenship in order to vote in national elections and state elections, and have already amended their state forms to that effect. And I look at the various legislatures across the nation that are now enacting voter ID provisions. And so when I look at what states are using this creative free-form incubator power to do, I'm very worried about that power. Instead, I look at legislation like the Voting Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was just pared down by the Supreme Court, and I look at how it has made our society so much more inclusive. And I look at the National Voter Registration Act, and I look at the national laws that have been passed, and they all seem to be in the spirit of greater inclusion, with an aim for equality and meaningful political participation. Not to say that states haven't done some progressive things, and there are some states that are doing that, but I feel much more concerned about allowing those decisions to be made at the state level.
Anyone else quickly before we move? Okay, Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Claudio about national standards for national elections, that is for House, Senate, and President. But I equally want to point to experiments on the local level that are interesting. There's one in Tacoma Park, Maryland right now where you can, at 16, you can vote for the local officials, for the mayor, school board, and so on. And kids really get into this. You know, the participation rate is higher in that 16 to 18-year-old group than it is with any other group, and they tend to keep voting after that, and voting is cool at Tacoma Park High School.
Yes, sir. Hi.
Hi, my name is Bert Thomas. I just wanted to ask about, you talk about non-citizen voting, and the obvious next step is, you know, a path to citizenship and the DREAM Act, or, you know, green card holders applying to become citizens. And then I sort of link the two, where if you give all these people citizenship, they suddenly have an ID for ID laws. And so what effect will it have if not only do you bring all those people into the citizen pool so they can vote, but then they also have, you know, frequently the people who aren't citizens are the ones without IDs, of course. And so, you know, what effect will that have as a domino effect to solve sort of multiple problems at once?
Anyone? If you don't have a comment, we can let the comment stand on its own. You think it's a good idea?
Well, I should admit, my wife is a green card holder, so I'm clearly biased. Thank you. But Ms. Nelson, if you could specifically, or any competing ideas.
On whether permitting non-citizens to vote then allows them to have voter ID cards in a way that would put them in tension with folks who are citizens.
How immigration reform and other steps could you know, start the ball rolling downhill.
Sure. So I mean, I think that's usually the popular counter argument to non-citizen voting, right? And it's saying, why don't you just become a citizen, and then that'll solve the problem. And we all know that it's not as easy as that. That there's a backlog, that there's differential treatment of persons depending on the nation that they're trying to immigrate from, so that it's not a perfectly equal and certainly not a swift process. I'm not really certain what the effect would be in terms of the ID component. I'm not really sure how you see that playing out, and I don't have a vision for that. But I do think that we ought to be, you know, thoughtful about how we treat this situation, and you know, immigration is a whole other bag of worms to think about, and it really does make us reconsider this whole notion of citizenship and how integral it is to universal suffrage, and does it need to be?
Okay, thank you. Hi, next question right here.
Jim Silkenet, question for Professor Nelson or any of the panelists. All of the voting rights issues that we've touched on here today have a practical application giving an advantage to one party or another. How do you persuade those parties to do the right thing here rather than to protect their interests? One can focus on voter ID. There is a practical advantage to one party there. How do you persuade the other party to stop doing what some of us view as the bad acts that they're currently pursuing.
Would you suggest that the advantage could be temporary or cyclical?
We're operating in today's world with
Right.
people voting on things today.
Okay. Any thoughts on this? How do you get people to make changes to the rules when it may be political suicide, essentially?
Well, that's true, and that is the purpose of these voter ID laws is to cause fewer Democrats to vote. It's not to prevent fraud. But
We'll get a rebuttal time
On
for
the
you.
other hand, the National Popular Vote Plan, Roger, I don't see how that advantages one side or another. And in fact, in lobbying for that plan, I find that whenever I say, well, look at these Republicans who are supporting it, then the Democrats get suspicious. You know, and when you say, and it works the other way too. And now the Democrats think, oh, but we've got an advantage in the Electoral College. You know, it's work. Let's not mess it up. We have no idea who would benefit from conducting a presidential election the way we conduct all the other elections, like gubernatorial and senatorial and the rest. We just don't know. And that's one of the things that makes it hard to sell.
Well, and rightly so. You know, as I said, you know, if you look at the last, you know, 200 some odd years and say that, well, you know, we've bumped along okay, and we've elected some people who weren't so good, but we also elected some good people, and we managed to get through, you know, a couple of world wars and a civil war and all that. Maybe we shouldn't just sort of say, hey, let's try something different when we don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, I think that ought to make it hard to sell. You know, I like your question. Because, I mean, I will tell you, I got into the issue of felon disenfranchisement because I was asked to testify before Congress in the late 1990s. And I was asked because the principal issue in the federal bill that was at issue was the scope of Congress's power under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment and Section 2 of the 15th Amendment, which was something I knew something about. I really didn't know anything about felon disenfranchisement. So I sort of, you know, got into the issue and got interested in it. And I think a lot of the research on how felons were likely to vote if they were reenfranchised hadn't been done. This is, you know, Ugin and Maza, I think, you know, had done, if I've got their names correct. And, you know, of course, sure enough, you know, it comes out that they published this paper that says, well, you know, if felons had been allowed to vote, then, you know, Gore would have been elected president. And all these senators, you know, who were Republican senators would have been Democratic senators. And I think it's very tempting for people who are involved in this issue to say, well, you know, we need to add that to our, you know, list of reasons why you should be in favor of this or why you should be against it. But I'm against that. I mean, I don't think that you should do that. I mean, I think that both sides should look at a question as fundamental as, you know, who gets to vote, and make a principled decision on what the right answer to that question is, and then stick by it, no matter how and let the chips fall where they may. I think that to say that, well, we're not going to let these people vote because they're going to vote for Democrats is a very bad thing. And that's something that Republicans should not do, and vice versa. I mean, I think that, you know, to say that, well, you know, we're against voter ID laws because we think that on balance that's going to help us win elections, and not to look at the evidence that voter fraud does exist is also wrong. How do we get politicians to think that way? I despair. I think it's very hard, you know, to tell politicians that they need to cast a blind eye on what's good for their party and, you know, on a partisan basis. But I do think that's the way the decision should be made.
Was this part of your question, Philip, about who should be making the decisions? Because if sitting members who might be giving away votes making the decisions are unlikely to get involved. Any thoughts on how to get out of that, or should we move on to the next question? I mean, that is a conundrum.
Well, I just want to underscore what Roger said. I mean, don't.
Roger's suggesting honor.
Exactly. And,
I don't know that will work, given the.
and I think that's right, but I do think that we do hold more power as voters than we think, right? So elected officials are unlikely to want to transform the system that got them into power. However, voters, I think, can take a more principled stance and getting back to this notion of popular sovereignty and how much we trust each other to be in this democratic enterprise together. If we have general principles that we think we can abide by, that are inclusive, that are non-discriminatory, then we can try to affect some change by electing elected officials who are pro-democracy, you know, and pro-democrat, little d. So I don't know if it's feasible, but I think it's in the hand of the voters.
Yeah, can I say something in relation to this precisely? I think this is one of the issues, if not the most important issue, where a national legislation for federal, uniform legislation for national elections has to be done. You know, there's nothing inherently wrong with voter IDs.
Right, I agree with you.
As a matter of fact, voter IDs in other countries are essential. And, you know, in my country, for instance, there's a national institute that is in charge of organizing elections, and you can very easily get your voter ID. You get it in a matter of, you know, it's a very simple procedure. And actually now it's become the official identification for virtually everything. I have my voter ID right here, really.
We'll need to see that before you.
I'll show it to you. You know, and so if you had a national uniform law, you wouldn't have this. The problem here is basically that some states establish certain kind of requirements of IDs because of political purposes, and there's no certainty. There's no equal treatment for
Roger, would
citizens.
you be in favor of a national ID card? I mean, it seems that the logical development of the ID laws would be a national identity card for everyone that would have your status on it. You couldn't, you know, you'd have to have one of these cards, and it would give your.
But how would you
tell who
obtain it? I
are
think
and your
that's
status.
important.
Hmm?
How would you obtain it, and who pays for it?
You would get it at birth, basically, and then it would
You
be
need a
like
national
Social Security.
agency to
It'd
produce
be like
it.
your Social Security card or your draft card.
No, seriously. I mean, you.
Janae has confirmed
needed to
Claudio's.
He's legitimate.
I mean, I would, you know, I would have to think about that. I think, you know, as I said, that you know, the problem with voter fraud is not chimerical, but I do think that if there are ways to ensure that we can have, you know, voter ID without disenfranchising people who shouldn't be disenfranchised, then, you know, I'm all for doing that. I don't know whether, you know, a national ID card is the best mechanism for that. I don't know.
Who's next? Who's a question or comment? Yes, sir, right down here in the front.
I'm Bob Weinberg. I'm a member of the ABA. And my question to all the panelists is, do you agree with the suggestion made a few days ago by Justice Stevens and made by many senators that we must have a constitutional amendment to overrule the Citizens United case and its progeny if we're going to preserve our democracy as we know it and prevent elections from being bought?
No, I don't agree with that. And I think I alluded to that earlier there. I said that I think that, you know, the way the power is exercised in democracy involves things other than, you know, simply going to the ballot box. And, you know, that includes speech. And I think that you cannot put limits on campaign expenditures without limiting speech.
I'd rather see a constitutional amendment that would change the way we choose the Supreme Court. None other than the governor of Texas in his presidential campaign had this in his platform. 17-year terms staggered so that a new justice is appointed, a justice appointed every 2 years, so that each presidential term gets 2 appointments. That's a long, long term. The justice would be a judge for life, who would serve on the court for 17 years. I think that what we've got now is too much of a lottery as to who gets to appoint whom, and it's getting worse as the country gets more polarized and partisan.
Okay.
And to solve these problems like one constitutional amendment, I'm all for Stevens's amendment, but it seems like a pretty laborious way to make legislation.
I do want to offer
ahead,
a
go,
voice
please.
in favor of Stevens's at least overall proposition that really the campaign finance cases of late are really a runaway train, and that something needs to be done to stop them. I do think there are real challenges to coming up with a constitutional amendment that would be worded in a way that could be enforceable to address the plethora of issues that these recent Supreme Court decisions have raised. But I do want to voice my support in standing with our former
My only
Supreme
reluctance
Court
is it's a whole other panel.
Yeah.
You know, that's,
But it's related. It's related when we talk
it
about
is certainly
whether
related.
the right to vote has any true meaning.
well, whether
And-
spending is speech. You know,
Yeah.
there's so many questions
Yeah,
here that are
absolutely.
huge that we just
Absolutely.
can't do justice to. Claudia, did you want to make a
I'll
quick?
pass
You're going to
because
pass based on that commentary? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. I'm a French student and currently interning at the ABA Center for Human Rights. My question is for Professor Crayutu. Sorry for the accent.
That's the
I-
French pronunciation.
Yeah. I did
He
understand.
speaks French, by the way, if you all want to just...
Don't encourage.
Maybe later. I didn't understand your point about lottery when you said that voting was not really democratic because it was partial. But isn't democracy about being able to have different tastes and being entitled to express it? Well, to say it differently, if someone says, well, I like his hair or I like his voice, I will vote for him, how is it undemocratic for you?
All democratic regimes of antiquity used lottery. They were the only democratic regimes until the 18th century, starting with ancient Greece, of course. There was some lottery used in the Roman Republic, but the voting system in the Roman Republic is very complicated. Take Montesquieu, your compatriot, and Rousseau as well. Rousseau thought, by the way, that if a country were to be governed by gods, it would govern itself democratically, but otherwise it's impossible. Rousseau also thought that democracy, elections were aristocratic. In the considerations on the representative government in Poland, for example, he says very clearly it's an elective aristocracy that should rule the country. Most of the Italian republics also used election. They were aristocratic regimes. The greatest republic in the history of Europe was Venice, which disappeared late, by the way. A history of Venice as an example of how aristocracy and democracy ought to be combined. They used elections. And I agree that elections are a mixed form. I didn't want to give the impression that lottery is purely democratic, elections are aristocratic. Elections have this dual nature. On the one hand, they give voice to the individuals, express the importance of consent, and that's why we no longer have lottery today. I forgot to mention that, because we believe that there is something valuable about consent. When you vote, you give your consent to the legitimacy of the laws, and that's fundamental. We no longer accept to be ruled by laws that we haven't consented to. But on the other hand, elections are supposed to create this aristocracy of representatives. I think it's this dual nature of election that makes them so interesting for us today. I wouldn't argue for lottery, so I was making a devil's advocate argument there. But it seems to me that if you really want democracy, that's lottery at the pure level, and everyone has an equal chance, right? And by the way, nobody would be upset that he or she lost the elections, as it were, right? And actually, historically speaking, if I understood correctly, the arguments that were made by various thinkers, that was a way to calm the tensions between factions. I mean, it's a form of impartiality, right? It's in the hands of God. It's sanctioned by a law that we don't control, in that sense.
Just can I complement this real quick? So the logic is pretty straightforward. So a random procedure instantiates the value of political equality unlike any other, right? If we are all equally competent, then let's just toss a coin, because there are no differentiating factors between us. Whereas the Greeks thought that, unlike that procedure, electing someone selecting someone involved identifying something in that person that made her stand out compared to others, even if it was the color of the hair or whatever you think. I mean, people, you might disagree with the criterion, but choosing someone as opposed to others involves looking at something that you think is more valuable. So in that sense, they thought that elections as such are inherently aristocratic.
I think we have time for one more question. Who has that question? Yes, sir. Gentleman back there on the aisle.
I'm Bob Wiggers. If I may actually toss out a couple. One, somebody up there mentioned that, well, he's worried about voters protecting the public interest. But isn't the point of voting being able to protect your own interests? And the other question is, we have a fairly broad franchise here, but so many people do not exercise it. Should there be a penalty, as they have in some other countries, for not voting?
That's a good question.
You know, the former, you mentioned Lee Hamilton, we were talking about him off the air, the former director of the center here, and now one of your colleagues out there at Indiana. One of his last interviews here when he was on this stage, and I asked Lee if he had any regrets about his time in Washington, and it happened to be an audience of high school students, so I know part of his answer was for effect. And he said he regrets supporting lowering the voting age because you don't use it. And so, I mean, just to go along with your question, but go ahead, who'd like to respond?
Well, I don't think people should be penalized for not voting. I mean, again, that seems to me to be a freedom that people ought to be able to exercise. So I would be against it for that reason. I'm also against it for the reason that, you know, as you all may predict now, we haven't done that before. And I think that there may be really good reasons why people who don't vote decide not to vote, and good effects from that. I think that, you know, people who don't vote may care less about elections, may be less informed about elections. And so them not voting, on balance, leads to better government.
I just point out that the turnout, voter turnout in battleground states in presidential elections is about 10 points higher than it is in spectator states. And that suggests that there are a lot of people who don't see the point as a political act of voting if there is not a contested election in the election they're voting in. I vote in New York. I do it as a sacrament. I do it to express something about, you know, about our country and my feelings about it. But I don't mistake it for a meaningful political act in a presidential election. New York's a blue state. You know, it doesn't matter whether what I do doesn't matter. And I think that
there are a lot of other elections other than
instead of punishing people
presidential.
for not voting, I'd like to see us reward people for voting with some say in who's going to rule them.
Walking around.
But there are a lot of other elections. We always, when you just focus on presidential elections, it can distort a discussion like this. There are a lot of other elections that have much more meaning based on unpredictability than a presidential election.
But there's still then what do you make of that pattern?
Well, some of those
pure
gerrymandered
coincidence?
districts might not be as predictable if you got turnout above 50%, especially in primaries where you're looking at turnout that's feeble, that's under 20%.
See, Rick, I think what this shows is the good effect of all this expenditures on elections, because I bet that those elections probably have more money spent on them.
If there, yes, a contested election will do that.
Janae,
It drives up turnout rates, and you ought to be in favor of that.
Janae, you have a thought?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to note that while we have not experimented in this way, there are other democracies who have. So Australia has compulsory voting, and it works rather successfully. As you might imagine, they have a high turnout. There's also an option not to vote, right? I don't know if it says I don't know or I don't care, but there certainly is an option to turn out and not,
But as a protest, not cast a vote.
Exactly, not actually be forced to choose a particular candidate or vote on a particular referendum. And I have to say, I frankly, I recognize that it might be a bit coercive. But I actually am in favor of including more people in the democratic discussion rather than excluding them. And if it takes some sort of incentivization, I'm
A free Chipotle gift card for all
I think we should
voters
consider
today.
it.
I know you get a lot of young voters to turn out for that. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I just want to say something about our panel, is that maybe I'm old-fashioned, but in an age of 140-character tweets, it's really a fun and a privilege to sit and hear big thinkers think big thoughts and share them with us. So thank you very much for doing that today. Also, I want to thank all of you who are applauding, and I want to thank those who joined us on the webcast, and thank our friends from the ABA. And to close things out, I want to call back to the microphone Jim Silkenat, the ABA president. If you could bring the microphone up here for James, and you can just stand and face the crowd from there, James, and take us home. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank John and our panel. This has been a wonderful discussion. We really could be here for a lot longer, and I think we would all benefit from that and an extended discussion here. I want to thank all of you for participating. We look forward to engaging all of you on these issues in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.